The priest caught me from behind after Mass. When I said that, I watched my entire family freeze around the Thanksgiving table. My oldest grandson dropped his iPhone on the hardwood floor. My daughter Susan choked on her wine. My son Michael, the family doctor, stared at me with wide eyes like I'd lost my mind. Even the Thanksgiving turkey seemed to be staring at me from the table, waiting for the rest of the story. My name is Dorothy Miller, but everyone's called me Dottie since I was born in Boston back in 1942. Today, I'm turning 82, and after 8 decades of keeping a secret, I decided it was finally time for the truth. The priest caught me from behind after Mass, I continued, watching the shocked faces around the table. Caught my life and turned it upside down. Today you'll know why. The room grew so quiet you could hear the November wind rattling the windows of my colonial home in Brookline. This same house Robert and I bought when we got married. The house where I raised 5 children. At least the 5 everyone knows about. My daughter-in-law Jennifer leaned forward, curious as always. The teenage twins stopped scrolling on their phones. Even my 6-year-old great-grandson stopped playing with his food and looked up at me. Maybe I should have waited until he went to bed before continuing. But truths have a way about them. Once they decide to come out, they're like a dam breaking after too much pressure. "Mom, are you okay?" Susan asked, concerned, reaching across the table to touch my arm. "Are you sure you want to talk about this today?" I nodded while adjusting the pearl necklace I received for my 80th birthday. Real pearls, the first ones I'd ever owned. At 82, you reach a point where you get tired of fake pearls. And fake truths, too. Kids, grandkids, today isn't just Thanksgiving and my birthday. It's the day you'll learn the true story of our family. I looked at Michael, my doctor's son, the one everyone says inherited his father's serious manner, but who has eyes so different from Robert's. Green eyes like emeralds, eyes that always reminded me of someone else in another time. "Michael, this envelope is for you." I pulled an aged, yellowed envelope from the pocket of my wool cardigan. An envelope I'd kept for over 60 years in a safety deposit box at Bank Boston, along with my marriage certificate and the house deed. An envelope a young priest had given me many decades ago on a cold Boston morning before disappearing from my life. "What's this, Mom?" Michael asked, taking the envelope carefully as if it might explode in his hands. "It's the truth, son. A truth I should have told you a long time ago, but never had the courage." The entire family was silent now. The Thanksgiving turkey getting cold, the sweet potato casserole with marshmallows that Susan had prepared with such care now forgotten. All eyes fixed on me and that old envelope. "Michael," I said, with the firmest voice I could muster, "your father, Robert Miller, the man who raised you, wasn't your biological father." A murmur ran around the table. My daughter-in-law Jennifer put her hand over her mouth. My oldest grandson dropped his fork onto his plate with a clatter that seemed even louder in the silence of the room. "Your real father was Father Anthony Sullivan from St. Augustine Parish in South Boston. We fell in love in the summer of 1963 when I was 19 and sang in the church choir. It was a forbidden love, a love that couldn't exist, but it did." Michael looked at the envelope in his hands as if he were holding a bomb about to explode. And perhaps he was, because that envelope held an even bigger secret, a secret that even I didn't know until a few days ago. "But that's not all," I continued, feeling my heart beating so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. "There's something in this envelope that will change everything we think we know about our family." Michael's hands were trembling now, and I could see in his eyes, those green eyes so much like Anthony's, a mix of shock, confusion, and curiosity. "You can open it, son. It's time for all of us to know the truth. But first, I need to tell you what happened 60 years ago in South Boston, when I was just a girl who dreamed of singing on the radio and worked at Filene's department store, not knowing my own life was based on a lie I couldn't even imagine." Everyone shifted in their chairs, completely forgetting about the food. The old Brookline house seemed to hold its breath along with my family as I prepared to tell a story that began much earlier than I ever imagined. Boston in 1963 was a different world. Kennedy had just been assassinated, and the whole city felt like it was in mourning. Black bunting still hung from windows in South Boston, where Irish Catholic families like mine treated JFK like he was one of our own. I was 19 that summer, with long dark hair that I wore in a flip like Jackie Kennedy, and dreams bigger than my neighborhood could hold. We lived in a 3-decker in South Boston, my parents and my 2 younger sisters. Dad worked at the shipyard, and Mom stayed home taking care of us. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. Just regular South Boston Irish Catholics going to Mass every Sunday and fish on Fridays. St. Augustine's Parish was the center of our world, where we got baptized, confirmed, and where I sang in the choir every Sunday. I had a good voice, not professional quality, but sweet enough that Mrs. O'Malley, the choir director, always gave me solos. I loved standing in front of the congregation in my blue choir robe, singing Ave Maria, while the sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. It made me feel special, like I was closer to God than everyone else. That summer, I worked at Feline's department store in downtown Crossing, selling gloves and scarves at the accessories counter. I'd take the T from Broadway Station every morning, wearing my white blouses and pencil skirts, feeling like a real career girl. My life was simple but good. I had a steady boyfriend named Jimmy Sullivan who worked at his father's auto shop. We'd go to the movies at the Paramount, or get ice cream at Bailey's, or sometimes just sit on the steps of my house on summer evenings, talking about the future. Jimmy wanted to marry me, but I wasn't sure. I had dreams of maybe being a singer or working my way up at Feline's to be a buyer someday. Marriage seemed so final, like closing a door on possibilities. Everything changed when Father Anthony Sullivan arrived at St. Augustine's that June. He came to replace old Father Murphy, who'd been sent to a retirement home after serving the parish for 30 years. Father Anthony was different from any priest I'd ever seen. Young, only 28, with thick dark hair and eyes so green they looked like emeralds. He'd graduated from Holy Cross College and just finished his training at St. John's Seminary in Brighton. The old ladies of the parish were immediately smitten with him, bringing him homemade bread and inviting him for Sunday dinners. I remember the first time I saw him. It was at Sunday Mass, and I was in the choir loft preparing to sing. He walked out to the altar in his white vestments, tall and straight-backed. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, with just a hint of a Boston accent. Not the heavy South Boston accent that most of us had, but something more refined, like he'd worked to smooth out the rough edges. "We gather here today as a community of faith," he said, looking out at the congregation. "A community that supports each other through joy and sorrow." His homily that day was about finding God in unexpected places, not just in church, but in the world around us, in the kindness of strangers, in moments of beauty, in music and art. He looked up at the choir loft as he said that last part, and our eyes met for just a second. I felt a strange flutter in my stomach, which I immediately tried to ignore. He was a priest, after all. It was wrong to even notice how handsome he was. After Mass, Mrs. O'Malley introduced the choir members to him. When it was my turn, he shook my hand and smiled. "Dorothy Callahan," Mrs. O'Malley said, "our best soprano. She's singing the solo for next Sunday's Mass." "I look forward to hearing you," Father Anthony said, holding my hand just a moment longer than necessary. "Do you live here in the parish?" "Yes, Father," I said, feeling awkward and formal. "On East 3rd Street. My family's been in the parish for 3 generations." He nodded, then asked something odd. "And before that? Where did your family come from before South Boston?" "Providence, Rhode Island," I said, surprised by the question. "My grandparents moved here in the 20s. Something flickered in his eyes. Interest or recognition? I couldn't tell which. "Providence," he repeated. "Did they ever mention St. Mary's orphanage there?" I was startled. "My grandmother worked there as a young woman. How did you know?" "Just a guess," he said quickly. "Many Irish Catholic families in New England have connections to the orphanages. The church was often the only support for immigrants. It seemed like a strange explanation, but I didn't question it. He was a priest after all, and I was just a girl from the neighborhood. But over the next few weeks, I noticed how often our paths crossed. He came to choir practice on Wednesday evenings, sitting in the back pew, supposedly working on his sermon, but often just listening while we sang. He'd make a point of complimenting me afterward, asking about my job at Feline's, my family, my life. He began asking me to help around the church, organizing the hymnal books, typing up the parish bulletin, helping with the altar society. My mother was thrilled that the new priest had taken an interest in my spiritual development, as she called it. She was always hoping I'd become a nun, though I had no interest in that life. But I liked being at the church, liked the quiet of the empty sanctuary in the late afternoons, liked the way the light came through the stained glass windows, casting blue and red pools on the worn wooden pews. And I liked being around Father Anthony. He was different from the other priests I'd known. He talked about books and music, politics and social change. He had opinions about the civil rights movement, about the war in Vietnam that was just beginning to make the news. He'd loan me books from his personal library, novels and poetry collections that I'd never have picked up on my own. But sometimes he'd ask strange questions, like if I remembered going to a particular beach on Cape Cod as a child, or if I knew a certain park in Providence. The oddest thing was, I did remember these places, even though I didn't recall ever telling him about them. How did he know about the summer cottage my grandparents had rented in Falmouth when I was small? Or the little park near the Providence train station where my mother used to take me when we visited relatives? "I've just got a good memory for details," he'd say when I asked how he knew these things. "You must have mentioned them." But I hadn't. I was sure of it. The strangest moment came one afternoon in late July. I was helping him organize the church office, filing papers and sorting mail. He opened his desk drawer and took out a small box. "I have something for you," he said, opening it to reveal an old rosary with dark beads and a silver crucifix. "It belonged to someone special. I'd like you to have it." I took it carefully. The beads were smooth from years of fingers moving over them in prayer. There was a small inscription on the back of the crucifix, M.E. 1943. "Who was M.E.?" I asked, running my thumb over the tiny letters. Father Anthony's face changed, like a shadow had passed over it. "Someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who reminds me of you." I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why this young priest seemed to know so much about me and my family, why he was giving me personal gifts, why he seemed to look at me with a mix of sadness and fascination. But I was 19, flattered by his attention, and too naive to see what was happening. It wasn't until later, much later, that I understood what had been set in motion that summer, a chain of events that would change my life forever. By the time I realized the truth, it was already too late. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more and more time at St. Augustine's. Father Anthony had asked me to help organize the parish files, which were in complete disarray after Father Murphy's sudden departure. I'd go there after my shift at Feline's, spending hours in the small office behind the sacristy, sorting through yellowed papers and dusty folders. My mother was delighted. "Such a good girl, helping out the new priest," she'd tell the neighbors, pride evident in her voice. My father would just nod approvingly over his newspaper. They had no idea that those afternoons in the quiet church were becoming the highlight of my days. It wasn't just because of Father Anthony, though his presence certainly made the work more interesting. There was something peaceful about being in the church when it was empty. Just the soft glow of the sanctuary lamp, the faint smell of incense, and the colored light filtering through the stained glass windows. I'd always loved St. Augustine's, with its worn wooden pews and marble altar, but now it felt like a sanctuary in more ways than one. Father Anthony would often join me, bringing coffee and styrofoam cups from the diner across the street. We'd sit amid the piles of papers, talking about everything and nothing. He was different from any priest I'd known. Younger, obviously, but also more open-minded. He talked about the changes coming to the church with Vatican II, about how services might soon be in English instead of Latin. He discussed politics and civil rights and the war in Vietnam that was just beginning to make headlines. "The church needs to evolve," he'd say, those green eyes intense. We can't stay stuck in the past forever. But it was the questions he asked that increasingly puzzled me. Strange, specific questions about my family history that seemed to come out of nowhere. Did your grandmother ever mention anything unusual about her time working at St. Mary's Orphanage? He asked one afternoon as we sorted through baptismal records. I looked up, surprised. Not really. She didn't talk about it much. Just that she worked in the nursery, taking care of the babies. The nursery, he repeated, as if confirming something to himself. Around 1943, perhaps? I think so. Why? He shrugged, focusing on the papers in front of him. Just curious. The Catholic orphanages were important institutions back then. So many children needed homes after the Depression, during the war. Another day, he asked if I remembered a particular beach on Cape Cod. That little cove near Falmouth, he said, with the lighthouse on the point. I stared at him, genuinely confused. How did you know about that place? My grandparents used to rent a cottage there when I was little. You must have mentioned it, he said, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I don't think I did, I replied, feeling a chill despite the summer heat. We haven't talked about Cape Cod at all. He changed the subject quickly, asking about the choir's plans for the upcoming Feast of the Assumption. But the odd moment lingered in my mind. The questions continued. Did I know Providence well? Had I ever visited the park near the train station? Did my mother ever take me to the children's library there? Each time, the details were eerily accurate. Places I had been, things I had done as a child, but had never discussed with him. I just have a knack for guessing these things, he'd say when I pressed him, with that smile that both charmed and disarmed me. Priests develop intuition about people. But it wasn't just intuition. It was as if he already knew me, knew my history, knew the places that had been important in my life. One rainy afternoon in early August, we were sorting through a box of religious items, old missals, prayer books, rosaries that had been left behind or donated to the church. Father Anthony reached into the box and pulled out a rosary with dark wooden beads and a silver crucifix. I want you to have this, he said, placing it in my palm. The beads were smooth from years of use, worn by countless prayers. I can't take this, I protested. It probably belongs to someone in the parish. It doesn't, he said firmly. It belonged to someone very special, and I'd like you to have it now. I turned the crucifix over in my fingers and noticed a small inscription on the back. M.E., 1943. Who was M.E.? I asked, looking up at him. His face changed, a shadow crossing those green eyes. Someone I knew a long time ago. Family? He hesitated, in a way. Someone who reminds me of you. There was something in his voice, a catch, a hint of emotion, that made me suddenly aware of how close we were sitting, our shoulders almost touching in the small office. Why do I remind you of her? I asked softly. He looked at me then, really looked at me in a way that made my heart beat faster. You have her spirit, her goodness, her... He trailed off, then added, her eyes. The way he said it, with such tenderness, such familiarity, sent a shiver through me, not of fear, but of something else, something I couldn't quite name. The confessional became another place where our conversations deepened. I'd go to confession every Saturday afternoon, as I'd done since my first communion. But now, knowing Father Anthony would be behind the screen, I found myself sharing more than just my sins. I'd talk about my hopes, my dreams, my frustrations with the limitations of life in South Boston. I feel like there's more out there for me, I confessed one Saturday. I love my family, I love this neighborhood, but sometimes I feel trapped. You have a searching spirit, Dorothy, he said, his voice soft in the dim confessional. That's not a sin. God gives us dreams for a reason. My parents want me to marry Jimmy Sullivan, I said. He's asked me twice already. There was a long pause. And what do you want? I don't know, I admitted. He's a good man. Steady job at his father's garage. Everyone says we'd make a good match. But I don't feel... I struggled to find the words. I don't feel that spark, that connection you're supposed to feel. Another pause. Longer this time. Connections are rare, Dorothy. When you find one, you recognize it immediately. It's like you've known the person forever, even if you've just met. His words hung in the air between us. I thought about how I felt sitting with him in the church office, how the hours flew by, how comfortable I was sharing my thoughts with him. Was that the kind of connection he meant? I should give Jimmy a fair chance, I said finally, more to myself than to him. Perhaps, he replied, and I thought I detected a hint of sadness in his voice. As I left the confessional, he handed me a small book through the screen. I thought you might enjoy this, he said. It was a poetry collection by Emily Dickinson. Inside the front cover, he'd written, "For Dorothy, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul." That night, reading the poems in my bedroom, I felt a growing awareness that something was happening between us, something that went beyond the normal relationship between a priest and a parishioner. The questions about my past, the gift of the rosary, the personal inscriptions, they all pointed to an interest that both thrilled and frightened me. One evening in late August, I was helping to clean the church after a wedding. Father Anthony was removing the special flowers from the altar when he suddenly stopped, looking at a small leather-bound book that had fallen from his pocket. I picked it up for him. "What's this?" I asked, noticing it was a kind of journal or diary. He took it quickly, almost snatching it from my hands. "Just some personal notes," he said. But not before I'd seen a photograph tucked between the pages, a young woman in a nun's habit, smiling at the camera. Something about her face struck me as oddly familiar, though I couldn't place why. A few days later, I was sorting mail in the parish office when I came across an envelope addressed to Father Anthony. It had been forwarded from somewhere else, and the return address was from Sisters of Mercy Convent, Providence, R.I. The name on the return label caught my eye. Sister Mary Elizabeth, M.E., the same initials inscribed on the rosary he'd given me. When I handed him the letter later that day, his face paled. He took it without comment and tucked it into his pocket. "Father," I said hesitantly, "who is Sister Mary Elizabeth?" He looked startled, then composed his features. "A colleague," he said shortly, "from my time in Providence." "Is she the M.E. from the rosary?" I pressed. His green eyes flickered with something, surprise, concern, before he nodded. "Yes, she passed away, some years ago." I wanted to ask more, but something in his manner discouraged further questions. He excused himself, saying he had sermon preparations to attend to, and disappeared into the rectory. That night, lying in bed, I turned the rosary over in my hands, running my fingers along the inscription. M.E. 1943, Sister Mary Elizabeth, a nun who had died. But who had she been to Father Anthony? A mentor? A friend? Something about the way he spoke of her suggested a deeper connection. And why did he say I reminded him of her? These questions swirled in my mind as I drifted off to sleep, the rosary clutched in my hand. Little did I know that the answers would come sooner than I expected, in a way that would change my life forever. As summer turned to fall in Boston, my relationship with Father Anthony began to change. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A lingering glance, a touch that lasted a moment too long, conversations that grew more personal with each passing day. I told myself it was innocent, that he was just a kind priest taking an interest in a parishioner. But deep down, I knew it was something more. September in Boston was always beautiful. The leaves just beginning to turn, the air growing crisp, the city alive with students returning to the colleges and universities that dotted the area. I continued my work at Feline's during the day and spent my evenings at St. Augustine's, helping Father Anthony with parish business. My mother was thrilled with my devotion to the church. My father simply nodded his approval when I'd leave the house after dinner, saying I was going to help Father Anthony with the parish bulletin or organize the choir music. One evening in mid-September, Father Anthony suggested we discuss the upcoming Columbus Day celebration. The Italian community in the North End always made a big deal of it, with processions and special masses. St. Augustine's, being an Irish parish, didn't celebrate as elaborately, but Father Anthony thought we should do something special. "Let's go over some ideas," he said, locking the church doors as we finished cleaning up after choir practice. "There's a little Italian place in the North End that's still open. We could get some dinner and talk about it." I hesitated. Going to dinner with a priest, even to discuss church business, seemed improper somehow. As if reading my thoughts, he added, "It's just a working dinner, Dorothy. I often meet with parishioners this way." So I agreed. We walked to his car, a black Plymouth station wagon that belonged to the parish. The drive to the North End took just 15 minutes. I'd rarely been to this part of Boston, the Italian section, with its narrow streets and the smell of garlic and tomato sauce wafting from the restaurants. It felt like entering another world, far from the familiar streets of South Boston. The restaurant was small and dimly lit, with red checkered tablecloths and candles in Chianti bottles. Father Anthony wasn't wearing his clerical collar. He'd changed into a dark sweater and slacks before we left the church. Without the collar, he looked like any other handsome young man, and I noticed how several women glanced appreciatively at him as we were shown to a corner table. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," he said as we settled in. "The food reminds me of Rome, where I studied for a year before being ordained." "You studied in Rome?" I asked, impressed. It seemed so exotic, so far from South Boston. "For a year at the North American College. It was formative." Something in his voice suggested there was more to the story, but he quickly changed the subject, asking about my work at Feline's, my dreams for the future. The waiter brought us wine, real Italian wine, not the sweet stuff my parents sometimes had at Christmas. I'd never tasted anything like it. As we ate pasta and talked about the church and the world and our lives, I felt a warm glow that wasn't just from the wine. Father Anthony was so different from the boys I knew in Southie, so worldly, so thoughtful, so interested in ideas. He asked about my thoughts on the civil rights movement, on the changes in the church, on what I wanted to do with my life. "I've never really left Boston," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm missing out on everything happening in the world." "The world is changing fast," he agreed. "Vatican II is going to transform the church in ways many people can't imagine yet. The old walls are coming down." His eyes held mine across the table, and I had the strange feeling he was talking about more than just church doctrine. The candlelight reflected in those green eyes, making them seem even more intense. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked suddenly, surprising myself with my boldness. "Becoming a priest, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment, twirling pasta around his fork. "The priesthood is a calling, not a choice," he said finally. "But sometimes I wonder what my life might have been if things had been different." "Different how?" He looked at me, really looked at me, and something passed between us, a current of feeling that made my heart race. If I hadn't made certain promises, if I hadn't carried certain responsibilities. The waiter interrupted, asking if we wanted dessert. The moment passed, but something had shifted between us. We drove back to South Boston mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have shared something important, something that didn't need words. After that night, our meetings became more frequent. We'd go to the North End for dinner, or sometimes just walk in Boston Common, pretending to run into each other accidentally if anyone we knew saw us. It was innocent on the surface, a priest and a parishioner discussing church matters, but we both knew it was becoming something else. October brought cooler weather and the Columbus Day celebrations. South Boston had its own small parade, nothing like the grand affair in the North End, but still a big event for our neighborhood. I stood with my family on Broadway, watching the marching bands and floats, when I spotted Father Anthony in the crowd across the street. He saw me at the same moment and smiled, not the public smile he gave to everyone, but a private one, just for me. After the parade, I told my parents I was going to help clean up at the church. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been a special mass that morning for Columbus Day, and the church did need cleaning. But my real reason was that I knew Father Anthony would be there. The church was empty when I arrived, the late afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light on the worn wooden pews. I found Father Anthony in the sacristy, changing from his vestments into his regular black shirt and clerical collar. "I was hoping you'd come," he said, his voice soft in the quiet room. I said I would help clean up. I was suddenly nervous, my heart beating too fast. Dorothy. Just my name, but the way he said it made me look up at him. He'd stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of incense that clung to his clothes from the morning's mass. "We need to talk about what's happening," he said quietly. "Between us." "I don't know what you mean," I lied, looking down at the floor. "Yes, you do." His hand touched my chin gently, lifting my face so I had to look at him. "This connection. I've tried to fight it. God knows I've tried." "You're a priest," I whispered. "We can't—" "I know." His voice was pained. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Dorothy. When I'm saying Mass, when I'm hearing confessions, when I'm lying awake at night. All I see is your face." I should have pulled away. I should have left the sacristy, left the church, gone back to my safe, predictable life. But I couldn't move. It was as if all the air had been sucked from the room, leaving only the space between us, charged with something I'd never felt before. "You remind me so much of her," he whispered, almost to himself. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Instead of answering, he leaned down and kissed me. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. All the feelings that had been building over the past months seemed to explode inside me, and I found myself kissing him back, my hands clutching the front of his shirt. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. The reality of what we'd just done hit me like a physical blow. I'd kissed a priest. In the sacristy of St. Augustine's Church, on Columbus Day. Each detail seemed to make it worse, more real, more terrifying. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back, running a hand through his dark hair. "I shouldn't have done that." "No, I didn't know what to say." I wasn't sorry. That was the terrifying truth. Despite everything I'd been taught about right and wrong, despite the mortal sin we just committed, I wasn't sorry at all. "Dorothy, we need to be careful," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If anyone found out—" I nodded, understanding all too well. In South Boston in 1963, a relationship between a priest and a parishioner would be more than a scandal. It would destroy both our lives. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice shaking. He took my hand, his green eyes serious. "I don't know. I just know I can't stay away from you anymore. God help me, I've tried." And so it began. Our secret meetings, our forbidden love. We were careful, always so careful. We'd meet in the church when no one was around, or sometimes in the Boston Public Library, where we could talk quietly among the stacks of books. Once in a while, we'd risk a dinner in the North End, where no one from South Boston would see us. It was innocent in a way, just kisses and whispered words, promises we both knew we couldn't keep, but it was the most thrilling, terrifying time of my life. Every moment with him felt stolen, precious, heightened by the knowledge that it couldn't last. And all the while, there were those moments when he'd look at me strangely and say, "You remind me so much of her." I never knew who she was, and somehow I was afraid to ask. There was so much about Anthony Sullivan I didn't know, so many secrets behind those green eyes. But I was 19, in love for the first time, and I thought we had all the time in the world to learn each other's truths. I had no idea how wrong I was. From October to December of 1963, I lived in two worlds. There was the public Dorothy, the good Catholic girl who worked at Feline's, sang in the choir, and still went on occasional dates with Jimmy Sullivan to keep up appearances. And then there was the secret Dorothy, the woman who was desperately, recklessly in love with a priest. Anthony and I developed a system for our meetings. We'd arrange them during confession on Saturday afternoons. He'd whisper a time and place while giving me absolution, which seems terribly sacrilegious now, but at the time felt like a thrilling secret code. Sometimes we'd meet in the church after hours when he was supposed to be doing paperwork and I was supposedly helping with parish duties. Other times we'd accidentally run into each other in Boston Common or the public library. We became masters of the casual public encounter. If anyone from the parish saw us, it was always perfectly innocent. Father Anthony happened to be at the same bookstore as me, or we crossed paths while he was on his daily walk. A priest talking to a parishioner was nothing unusual, even if we stood a bit too close, or our conversations lasted a bit too long. Once a week, we'd risk a dinner in the North End. Those were the evenings I lived for, when we could sit across from each other at a small table in the back of an Italian restaurant, pretending to be just another couple. Anthony never wore his collar on those nights, and I'd dress up in my prettiest clothes, feeling like a real woman on a date instead of a girl playing at something forbidden. "If things were different," he'd say sometimes, twirling pasta around his fork, his green eyes reflecting the candlelight. "I'd take you dancing at Mosley's on the Charles. We'd go to see the Red Sox at Fenway in the summer. We'd do all the normal things couples do." "Do you ever think about leaving?" I'd ask, my voice dropping to a whisper even though no one could hear us. "Leaving the priesthood, I mean." The question always brought a shadow to his face. "It's complicated, Dorothy. There are obligations I have, promises I've made. To God, to someone I loved very much." He never elaborated, never explained who that someone was. There were so many mysteries about Anthony Sullivan, so many questions he wouldn't answer. Where had he grown up? Why had he become a priest? Who was the woman in the nun's habit, the one in the photograph he sometimes looked at when he thought I wasn't watching? And why did I remind him of her? Sometimes, in the middle of a conversation about music or books or politics, he'd look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of tenderness and sorrow, as if he was seeing someone else in my face. "You remind me so much of her," he'd murmur, almost to himself. Then he'd shake his head slightly, as if waking from a dream, and change the subject. I tried asking directly once, during one of our dinners in the North End. "Anthony, who is she? The woman you say I remind you of?" He took a sip of wine, staring into the glass as if the answer was swimming somewhere in the dark red liquid. "Someone I lost," he said finally. "Someone who was very special to me." "A girlfriend from before you became a priest?" A small, sad smile touched his lips. "No, not a girlfriend. Family. She died young." "I'm sorry," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "It was a long time ago," he replied, turning his hand to hold mine. "But when I first saw you in the church that day, singing in the choir, it was like seeing a ghost. The resemblance is remarkable." I wanted to press further, to ask if this woman was the ME from the Rosary, if she was the nun in the photograph. But something in his expression warned me not to push too hard. I was 19, in love, and afraid of breaking the spell between us. So I let it go, telling myself there would be time to learn all his secrets. In November, as the days grew shorter and colder, our meetings became more difficult to arrange. The parish was busy preparing for Thanksgiving and then Advent. More people were coming to confession. More committee meetings were being held in the evenings. Anthony had less time to slip away, and I was busy at Feline's with the holiday shopping season. But somehow, we managed to steal moments together. Brief meetings in the sacristy after choir practice. A quick walk in Boston Common during my lunch hour. Furtive kisses in the shadows of the church when everyone else had gone home. It was during one of these stolen moments in early December that I noticed something odd. We were in Anthony's office in the rectory, a risky place to meet, but the housekeeper was out and it was raining too hard to walk in the park. He'd gone to make us coffee, and I was waiting, looking at the books on his shelf, when I noticed a leather-bound journal on his desk. It was open, and I couldn't help glancing at what was written there. It wasn't a diary, as I'd first thought. It was some kind of research log. There were lists of names, dates, places. St. Mary's Orphanage appeared several times, along with Providence RI and Case W1742. There were notes about birth records and adoption papers. And at the bottom of one page, circled in red ink, Dorothy Callahan, confirmed match? I quickly stepped away from the desk when I heard him coming back with the coffee. But my mind was racing. What was Anthony researching? Why was my name in his notes? What did confirmed match mean? Over the next few weeks, I noticed other strange things. Twice, I saw him talking to men in suits who didn't look like parishioners, more like lawyers or officials of some kind. Once, I overheard him on the phone in the parish office saying, "I've confirmed it. She's definitely the one. The resemblance is unmistakable, and the dates match." I told myself I was imagining things, seeing mysteries where there were none. Maybe he was just working on some church business, helping someone trace their family history or dealing with a legal matter for the parish. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The questions about my family, the mentions of St. Mary's Orphanage, the photograph of the nun, the rosary with M.E. engraved on it, they were all connected somehow, and they were all connected to me. December brought snow to Boston, turning the city into a Christmas card scene. South Boston looked beautiful under a blanket of white. The three-deckers with their front porches decorated with colored lights, wreaths on the doors, plastic Santas and reindeer on some of the lawns. St. Augustine's was especially lovely, with candles in the windows and a large nativity scene on the front lawn. Anthony seemed increasingly distracted as Christmas approached. He was busy with parish duties, of course, Advent services, charity work, preparing for the Christmas masses, but it was more than that. He seemed worried, preoccupied, as if he was wrestling with some difficult decision. One evening, just a week before Christmas, we managed to meet in the church after a choir practice. Everyone else had gone home, and we sat in the back pew, talking quietly while snow fell outside the stained glass windows. "Dorothy," he said, taking my hand, "there's something I need to tell you." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about why I came to St. Augustine's, about why—" He hesitated. "About why I was drawn to you." My heart was pounding. "Tell me," I whispered. But before he could continue, the church door opened with a bang, letting in a gust of cold air and snow. It was Mrs. O'Malley, the choir director, who had forgotten her music folder. She stopped short when she saw us sitting together in the back pew, my hand in Anthony's. "Father Anthony," she exclaimed, her voice sharp with surprise. "Dorothy, what are you two doing here so late?" Anthony pulled his hand away smoothly, his face immediately assuming the calm, professional expression of a priest. "Just discussing the Christmas music, Mrs. O'Malley." Dorothy had some ideas for her solo. Mrs. O'Malley looked unconvinced, her eyes narrowing as she glanced between us. "Well, it's getting late. I'm sure Dorothy's parents will be wondering where she is." "Of course," Anthony said, standing up. "I was just about to walk Dorothy home. It's dark, and the sidewalks are slippery with snow." "That won't be necessary, Father," Mrs. O'Malley said firmly. "My husband is waiting in the car. We can drive Dorothy home." And so I left with Mrs. O'Malley, feeling her suspicious gaze on me as we walked to her husband's waiting Buick. Anthony's revelation, whatever it was, would have to wait. As Mr. O'Malley drove me home through the snowy streets, I stared out the window, wondering what Anthony had been about to tell me. What secret was he hiding? Why had he really come to St. Augustine's? And what did it have to do with me? I had no idea that I would find out the answers much sooner than I expected, and that they would change my life forever. By mid-December, I knew something was wrong before I even missed my period. Call it woman's intuition, or just the subtle changes in my body that I was too attuned to ignore. I felt different, more tired, slightly nauseated in the mornings, my breasts tender in a way they'd never been before. I tried to convince myself it was stress, or maybe a flu coming on, but deep down, I knew. Still, I waited until after Christmas to buy the test. It was almost impossible to get one in South Boston without everyone knowing your business, so I took the T downtown one snowy afternoon when I was supposed to be Christmas shopping. The pharmacist at Woolworth's gave me a disapproving look when I asked for it, his eyes dropping to my left hand to check for a wedding ring. I hid the small brown paper bag inside my larger shopping bag from Jordan Marsh, among the Christmas presents I'd bought for my family. I took the test early on a Sunday morning, locked in the bathroom while my parents and sisters were still asleep. Those few minutes waiting for the result were the longest of my life. When the test showed positive, confirming what I already knew in my heart, I sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried silently, my hand pressed against my mouth to muffle the sound. Pregnant, with a priest's child. In 1963, Boston, I might as well have committed murder for how society would judge me. For days, I walked around in a daze, going through the motions of life, working at Feline's, singing in the choir, helping my mother with the Christmas preparations. Inside, my mind was racing through impossible scenarios. I could leave Boston, go to New York perhaps, have the baby in secret. I could give it up for adoption. I could tell my parents and face their fury and disappointment. None of the options seemed bearable. When I finally worked up the courage to tell Anthony, we met in the sacristy after the Friday evening Lenten service. The church was nearly empty, just a few old ladies still praying in the front pews. I closed the sacristy door behind me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break my ribs. "Anthony," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. He looked up from where he was arranging the vessels for Sunday's Mass, a smile starting to form on his face. Then he saw my expression, and the smile disappeared. "What's wrong?" he asked, coming around the table toward me. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, tears filling my eyes. He led me to the wooden chair in the corner, helped me sit down. "Dorothy, what is it? Are you ill?" "I'm pregnant," I finally managed to say, the words hanging in the air between us. I expected shock, fear, perhaps anger. What I didn't expect was the way the color drained from his face, the way he stumbled back as if I'd struck him, the way he whispered, "History repeats itself." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused by his reaction. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he paced the small room, running his hands through his hair again and again. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "Not again. Not to you." "Anthony, please," I said, reaching for his hand. "I'm scared. We need to figure out what to do." He stopped pacing and knelt in front of me, taking both my hands in his. His green eyes were intense, focused. "We'll leave," he said with sudden certainty. "We'll go to California. I have some money saved. I'll find work there, teaching perhaps. We'll get married, raise our child together." "But you're a priest," I said, still not fully comprehending what he was suggesting. "I'll leave the priesthood," he said firmly. "I should have done it months ago, when I first realized how I felt about you. This is a sign, Dorothy. We're meant to be together." His certainty calmed me. We spent the next hour making plans in whispered conversations. We would leave during Holy Week, when everyone would be busy with Easter preparations. He would buy the bus tickets to California. I would pack only what I could carry in one suitcase, tell my parents I was going on a retreat with the church youth group. We'd be married in a civil ceremony as soon as we arrived in California. He'd find work, I'd have the baby, and we'd build a life together far from the judgments of Boston. It was a desperate plan, full of holes and uncertainties, but it was a plan. For the first time since seeing the positive pregnancy test, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could make this work. Maybe we could be a family. The following week, Anthony went to Boston to buy the bus tickets. I started quietly setting aside clothes, a few precious photographs, the little money I had saved from my job at Feline's. I wrote a letter to my parents that I would leave behind, explaining that I had fallen in love and gone to start a new life. I didn't mention Anthony or the pregnancy. That would come later, once we were settled, once the shock had worn off. We were careful, so careful. We barely spoke at church, maintained our separate routines. But somehow, someone found out. I never discovered who it was, whether someone had seen us together, overheard our plans, or perhaps Anthony had confided in the wrong person. All I know is that on the Wednesday before we were supposed to leave, everything fell apart. I was at work at Feline's when the store manager came to find me at the accessories counter. "Dorothy, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice tight with disapproval. "In the manager's office." I followed her, puzzled, my stomach tightening with apprehension. When she opened the office door, I saw my father sitting there, his face gray and old, in a way I'd never seen before. And beside him was Cardinal Cushing himself, the Archbishop of Boston, in his black suit with the red piping and collar. "Miss Callahan," the Cardinal said, his voice gentle but firm. "Please sit down." I sat, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. My father wouldn't look at me. "It has come to our attention," the Cardinal continued, "that you have been involved in an inappropriate relationship with Father Sullivan, and that you are planning to leave Boston with him." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up with fear. "Your father has agreed that the best course of action is for you to go stay with your aunt in Providence until your condition resolves itself. The church will arrange for the child to be adopted by a good Catholic family." My father finally looked at me then, his eyes filled with pain and disappointment. "How could you, Dorothy?" he asked, his voice cracking. "With a priest? Don't you know what this will do to your mother? To our family?" "I love him," I whispered, the only defense I could offer. The Cardinal shook his head sadly. "What you feel is not love, my child. It is temptation, sin. Father Sullivan has broken his sacred vows, betrayed his calling. He will be removed from St. Augustine's immediately and sent to a mission in Alaska where he can reflect on his sins and seek redemption." "Alaska?" I gasped. "No, you can't. It's done," the Cardinal said firmly. "He's being informed of the transfer as we speak. He'll be gone by tomorrow morning." I felt the room spin around me. Alaska, on the other side of the continent, and I was to be sent to Providence to have my baby in secret, to give it up for adoption. Our plan, our desperate, beautiful plan of a life together in California, was shattered. "I won't go," I said, finding my voice again. "I won't give up my baby." My father stood up then, his face hard with anger and shame. "You will do as you're told, Dorothy. For once in your life, you will obey. This mistake will be dealt with, and then we'll never speak of it again. Do you understand me?" I understood then that I had no power, no say in what happened to me or my child. I was 19, unmarried, pregnant with a priest's baby. In the Boston of 1963, that made me little more than a criminal, someone to be hidden away, my sin erased as if it had never happened. They took me home that day, my father and the Cardinal. My mother was waiting, her eyes red from crying, my sisters sent to stay with neighbors so they wouldn't witness my disgrace. I was to pack a bag. They were driving me to Providence that very night. My aunt had already been informed, a story concocted about me helping her with her new baby while taking classes at the community college there. But I had one desperate hope left. Somehow, I had to see Anthony before they sent him away. I had to tell him about our baby, had to make one last attempt to salvage our plans. If I could just talk to him. I never imagined that within 24 hours, both our lives would change forever, in ways neither of us could have foreseen. And I never imagined that the final conversation with the father of my child would take place in the most unexpected of locations, an empty Fenway Park, under a sky-threatening snow, with secrets finally revealed that would haunt me for the next 60 years. I had one desperate hope left, to see Anthony before they sent him away. My father had driven me home from Feline's, the Cardinal sitting in the front seat next to him, both men rigid with disappointment and shame. At home, my mother was red-eyed from crying, packing a small suitcase for me. I was to leave for Providence that night, to stay with my Aunt Margaret until the situation was resolved, their euphemism for having my baby in secret and giving it up for adoption. "I need to use the bathroom," I said quietly as my father carried my suitcase to the car. My mother nodded, too upset to speak. As soon as I was alone in the bathroom, I climbed out the small window, scraping my knee on the sill. I ran down the alley behind our house, praying no neighbors would see me. I had no plan, only the desperate need to find Anthony before they took him away. I didn't know where they were keeping him. The rectory, the cardinal's residence, some other church facility. I had no money for a taxi, just the few dollars in my coat pocket. I started walking towards St. Augustine's, hoping against hope that he might be there, or that someone there might know where he was. The church was dark when I arrived, locked for the night. I peered through the windows but saw no movement inside. The rectory next door showed a light in one window, but when I knocked, it was the housekeeper who answered, her face hardening when she saw me. "He's not here," she said before I could speak, "and you shouldn't be either. Go home, girl." "Please," I begged. "I need to talk to him, just for a few minutes. Where is he?" She started to close the door, then hesitated. Something in my face must have moved her, desperation, heartbreak, or simply youth in pain. "They've got him at the seminary in Brighton," she said in a low voice. "But he's leaving at dawn for Logan Airport. That's all I know." She closed the door quickly, as if afraid of being caught in this small act of kindness. The seminary in Brighton, miles away, with no way to get there at this hour. I stood on the rectory steps, feeling defeat wash over me. Then I remembered something Anthony had told me once, during one of our conversations about Boston. He loved baseball, had been a promising player in college before choosing the priesthood. "Fenway Park is my cathedral," he'd said with that smile that made my heart skip. "Sometimes I go there just to sit and think when the stadium is empty." It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I walked to Broadway Station and took the T to Kenmore Square, using the last of my money. By the time I reached Fenway Park, my feet were sore, my face raw from the cold. Snow was beginning to fall in light flurries that caught in my hair and eyelashes. The stadium was dark, of course, closed for the winter. I walked around the perimeter, not even sure what I was looking for. Then I saw him, a solitary figure sitting on a bench across from the main entrance, hands clasped between his knees, head bowed. Even without his collar, I would have recognized Anthony anywhere. "Anthony," I called softly, crossing the street. He looked up, his face registering shock, then something like pain and joy mixed together. He stood quickly, catching me by the arms as I reached him. "Dorothy, what are you doing here? How did you find me? The housekeeper told me you were at the seminary, but I couldn't get there." I was crying now, the words tumbling out. Then I remembered what you said about Fenway, about coming here to think, and I had to try. He pulled me down to sit beside him on the bench, his hands still holding mine. The snow was falling harder now, creating a curtain of white around us, as if we were alone in the world. "They're sending me to Providence tomorrow," I told him. "To my aunts. They want me to give up our baby for adoption." His face crumpled. "I'm so sorry, Dorothy. This is all my fault. I never should have—" "No," I interrupted. "Don't say that. I don't regret anything. I love you." "I love you too," he said, his voice breaking. "More than I thought possible. That's why this is so complicated. We can still go to California," I said desperately. "Tonight. We could take a bus, start over." He shook his head, his green eyes filled with sadness. "They've taken my passport, my wallet, everything. I'm under guard at the seminary. I only managed to slip out because one of the younger priests, a friend, agreed to cover for me for an hour. By dawn, I'll be on a plane to Alaska." "Alaska," I whispered, the word feeling as cold as the snow falling around us. "When will you come back?" "I don't know. Years, probably. The cardinal was explicit. I'm not to set foot in Boston again." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our situation settling over us. Then Anthony reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. "I've been carrying this, hoping somehow to get it to you," he said, pressing it into my hands. "Keep it safe. Open it when our child turns 18. I looked at the envelope. It was addressed simply to ML. "Who is ML?" I asked. He hesitated. "Someone who is very important to me. Someone who connects us in ways you don't yet understand." "I don't understand now," I said, confusion mixing with my sadness. "You will, someday." He touched my face gently. "The truth is complicated, Dorothy. I came to St. Augustine's for a reason connected to you." "To me? But you didn't know me before you came." "I knew of you," he said cryptically. "I'd been looking for you." Before I could ask what he meant, he continued, urgency in his voice. "Listen to me, Dorothy. This is important. Whatever happens, whatever they tell you to do, don't give up our baby. Fight for our child. Promise me." "I promise," I said, though I had no idea how I would keep such a promise against the combined pressure of my parents and the church. "When the baby is born, name him Michael if it's a boy, Elizabeth if it's a girl." His voice was insistent. "Michael or Elizabeth," I repeated. "But why those names?" "They're family names," he said simply. "Kita Bemdele," he added, slipping into what sounded like Portuguese or Spanish. "Someday you'll understand everything." He glanced at his watch and stood up. "I have to go back now, or they'll discover I'm gone." I stood too, panic rising in my chest. "Anthony, please don't go. There has to be a way." "There isn't. Not now." He pulled me close, kissing me with a desperation that matched my own. "But I promise you this, Dorothy. Someday I'll find you again. Both of you." "How?" "They're taking me to Providence. After that, who knows where I'll end up." He smiled slightly, though his eyes remained sad. "I've found you once before. I'll find you again." Before I could ask what he meant, he pressed something into my hand, a small piece of paper. "My mother's address in Vermont," he explained. "She'll always know how to reach me. When it's safe, when our child is older, write to her." I clutched the paper, memorizing the address immediately in case I lost it. Just then, a church bell somewhere in the distance struck the hour. Anthony looked toward the sound, his face tightening. "I have to go," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Dorothy, whatever happens, know that I love you, and I'll love our child, always." He kissed me one last time, then turned and walked away, his figure quickly disappearing into the falling snow. I stood there, the envelope in one hand, the address in the other, watching until I couldn't see him anymore. The snow was falling heavily now, covering my footprints, erasing all evidence of our meeting. I felt oddly calm, despite the enormity of what had just happened. Perhaps I was in shock, or perhaps some part of me knew that this wasn't really the end of our story. I walked back to the tea station, not even feeling the cold anymore. When I reached home, my parents were frantic, the police had been called, and a search was underway. My father took one look at my snow-covered coat and tear-stained face and knew where I'd been. "It's over, Dorothy," he said firmly. "The priest is gone. Tomorrow you go to Providence, and we'll put this whole disgraceful episode behind us." I didn't argue. I let them bundle me into the car, drive me to my aunt's house in Providence, where I would spend the next 6 months hiding my growing belly and preparing to give birth to a child I was expected to give away. But inside, I held on to Anthony's words, his promise that he would find us again, and the mysterious envelope that I tucked into my Bible for safekeeping. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't know for decades, was that Anthony Sullivan had given me only part of the truth that snowy night at Fenway Park. The mystery of who he was, why he had come to Boston looking for me, and who ML really was would take 60 years to fully unravel. And when the truth finally came out, it would shake the foundations of everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. Within a month after Anthony was sent to Alaska, I found myself standing in St. Elizabeth's Church in Providence, marrying Robert Miller. He was 45, a Korean War veteran who owned a hardware store on the east side of the city. I was 20, visibly pregnant, despite my mother's attempts to let out my wedding dress at the seams. It wasn't the wedding I had dreamed of as a little girl. There was no white gown with a long train, no bridesmaids in pastel dresses, no reception with dancing and champagne toasts. Just a small ceremony with immediate family, followed by a quiet lunch at my aunt's house. Robert was a good man. I can say that now, looking back over the decades. At the time, I resented him for not being Anthony, for being part of the solution my parents and the church had arranged for my problem. But he knew what he was getting into when he agreed to marry me. His first wife had died 2 years earlier, leaving him with 2 small boys to raise, Jack, who was 7, and Tommy, who was 5. He needed a mother for his sons, and I needed a name for my child. It was a practical arrangement, sanctified by the church, but understood by both of us to be something less than a love match. The first months of our marriage passed in a strange fog. I moved into Robert's colonial house in Brookline, a suburb just outside Boston proper. It was a nice house, with hardwood floors and a garden in the back where his boys played. I learned to cook for a family, to wash and iron little boys' clothes, to bandage scraped knees and read bedtime stories. The boys were wary of me at first, as children are of any new adult in their lives, but they were good kids, well-behaved, and eager to please. Robert slept in the master bedroom, and I took the guest room, which we told everyone was temporary because of my delicate condition. But both of us knew this arrangement would continue even after the baby was born. Robert was a gentleman, never pushing for more than I could give. At night, I would sometimes hear him pacing in his room, or the low murmur of the radio as he sat up late, unable to sleep. I wondered if he regretted his decision, if he looked at his pregnant young wife and wondered what he had gotten himself into. I gave birth to my son on July 17, 1964, at Massachusetts General Hospital. Robert drove me there when my water broke, stayed with me through the early hours of labor, then retreated to the waiting room with the other fathers when things got serious. Back then, men weren't allowed in the delivery room. I was alone with the doctors and nurses when my son came into the world, screaming his outrage at being pushed from his safe, warm home into the bright, cold hospital room. When they placed him in my arms, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket, I looked into his face and saw Anthony. He had the same green eyes, rare in newborns, the nurse commented, and the same strong chin. I named him Michael, as Anthony had asked me to. Robert, to his credit, never objected to the name, though he must have known it wasn't chosen for any connection to him or his family. On the birth certificate, Robert Miller was listed as the father. It was a lie, but a legal one, accepted and even encouraged by society. Born a little early, everyone would say with a knowing look when they saw how big and healthy Michael was for a supposedly premature baby. The fiction of the slightly early birth was maintained to preserve the appearance that he had been conceived after the wedding. No one spoke of the truth directly, but everyone knew. In Boston in the 1960s, appearances mattered more than reality. Robert was better with Michael than I had expected. He held him carefully, talked to him in the same gentle voice he used with his own sons, bought him toys and clothes just as nice as those he bought for Jack and Tommy. To the outside world, we were a normal, happy family, a father, a mother, 3 growing boys. Robert's hardware store did well. We moved to a bigger house in Brookline when Michael was 2, and I started taking classes at Boston College, studying for a teaching degree. But there was always a distance between Robert and Michael, a subtle difference in how he treated his biological sons versus the boy who wasn't his. Nothing cruel or deliberate. Robert wasn't that kind of man. Just small things, noticeable perhaps only to me, who watched with a mother's keen eye. The way he roughhoused more freely with Jack and Tommy. The way he would absently ruffle their hair when passing by, but rarely touched Michael the same way. The way his face lit up with recognition when Jack did something that reminded him of himself, a connection he couldn't feel with Michael. And as Michael grew, the differences between him and his brothers became more apparent. Jack and Tommy were stocky and brown-eyed like their father, with the same square hands and practical manner. Michael was taller, leaner, with those startling green eyes and a quickness of mind that sometimes left the rest of us scrambling to keep up. He was thoughtful where the other boys were action-oriented, preferred books to baseball, and showed an early interest in science and medicine that none of us could explain based on family history. "He gets his brains from your side," Robert would sometimes joke when Michael brought home another perfect report card. It was his way of acknowledging the situation without directly addressing it. In 16 years of marriage, Robert and I never once discussed the fact that Michael wasn't his biological son. It was a silence that defined our relationship, a thing so large and obvious that it became invisible through sheer size. I kept Anthony's letter in the back of my jewelry box, wrapped in a silk handkerchief. The envelope addressed to ML remained sealed in my safety deposit box at the bank, as did the piece of paper with his mother's Vermont address. I had promised to write when it was safe, when Michael was older, but the years passed, and I never did. What would I say? That I had married another man, given his son another father's name? That I had moved on with my life, as he had presumably moved on with his? Sometimes I would take out the rosary he had given me, run my fingers over the worn beads and the inscription, M.E. 1943. I would wonder about Sister Mary Elizabeth, the nun whose photograph I had glimpsed, the woman Anthony said I resembled so strongly. Was she a relative of his? A friend? Someone he had loved? The questions remained unanswered, locked away like the envelope in the safety deposit box. The years passed, as they do. Michael grew into a serious, thoughtful boy with a natural aptitude for science. When he was 12, he announced at dinner that he wanted to be a doctor. Robert nodded approvingly and said he'd help pay for medical school if Michael kept his grades up. It was one of the many generous things Robert did for a boy who wasn't his son. When Michael was 17, he was accepted to Harvard on a partial scholarship. I remember standing in the kitchen when the letter arrived, watching him tear open the envelope, his green eyes, so like Anthony's, widening as he read the acceptance. Robert clapped him on the back, genuinely proud, and took us all out to dinner to celebrate. That night, lying in my separate bed in the room that had long ago ceased to be temporary, I thought about writing to Anthony at the Vermont address. Surely now it was safe. Michael was almost grown, about to go to college. The scandal, if it ever came out, would be minimal after so many years. But something held me back. Fear, perhaps, or simply the weight of habit. It had been 18 years since that snowy night at Fenway Park. Anthony could be anywhere by now. He might have a new life, a family of his own. He might not want to be reminded of a long-ago love affair with a naive girl from South Boston. Or worse, he might still care, might still want to be part of our lives, disrupting the careful balance we had all maintained for so long. So I said nothing, did nothing. Michael went off to Harvard, graduated summa cum laude, and was accepted to Harvard Medical School. Robert attended the graduation ceremony with me, sat beside me clapping as Michael received his diploma, posed for family photos with a hand on Michael's shoulder, the father who had raised him, if not the father who had given him life. It wasn't until Robert died, suddenly of a heart attack while working in his store in 1998, that I finally allowed myself to seriously consider reaching out to Anthony. By then, Michael was a successful cardiologist at Mass General, married to a lovely woman named Jennifer, with 3 children of his own. The scandal, if it ever broke, would hardly touch him now. And I was a 60-year-old widow, beyond the reach of the social strictures that had seemed so powerful when I was young. Still, I waited. Another year, then another. The envelope remained sealed, the Vermont address untouched, until one day in 2022, sitting at my computer in my Brookline home, I typed Father Anthony Sullivan into a search engine, not really expecting to find anything after all these years. And there he was, in a small news article from a Vermont newspaper, standing in front of a community library. Former Catholic priest Anthony Sullivan, 87, cuts the ribbon at the opening of the new Franklin County Library annexation, read the caption. The old man in the photograph bore little resemblance to the young priest I had known. His hair was white, his face lined with age. But the eyes, those green eyes that our son had inherited, were unmistakable. That was when I finally made the decision that would bring us all to this Thanksgiving table, 60 years after my world had been turned upside down by a young priest in a church in South Boston. The decision that would lead us to the truth, a truth far more complicated and shocking than even I could have imagined. The years passed quickly, as they do when you're raising children and building a life. Michael graduated from Harvard Medical School with honors and became a respected cardiologist at Mass General Hospital. He married Jennifer, a pediatric nurse he'd met during his residency, and they gave me 3 beautiful grandchildren. I moved from the big house in Brookline after Robert died to a smaller colonial in the same neighborhood. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm of family dinners, holidays, and the occasional trip to the Cape in the summer. But the envelope remained in my safety deposit box, sealed and waiting, like a time bomb that had never been detonated. Sometimes months would pass without my thinking about it, and then something would trigger a memory. A man with green eyes passing me on the street, a news item about Alaska, a young priest giving a sermon at St. Augustine's when I visited my old neighborhood. And I would remember Anthony Sullivan, and the secret I had kept for so long. After Robert died in 1998, I thought more often about contacting Anthony. What held me back was partly fear of disrupting Michael's life, fear of resurrecting old pain, fear of what might be in that envelope I'd never opened. But it was also uncertainty. Where was Anthony now? Was he still alive? Had he remained a priest? Or had he left the church as so many did in the years after Vatican II? Would he even remember me? Or had I been just one mistake in a long life of service to God? I told myself that I was protecting Michael by keeping the secret. He had a good life, a successful career, a loving family. Why complicate things with revelations about his biological father? Robert, for all his distance, had been a good father to him, had paid for his education, had given him a name and a stable home. Wasn't that enough? But as I got older, approaching my 80s, I began to feel the weight of unfinished business. The lies we tell ourselves about protecting others are often just excuses for protecting ourselves. The truth was that I was afraid of judgment, afraid of rejection, afraid of discovering that the love I had cherished in my heart for 60 years had meant nothing to Anthony Sullivan. Then came that day in 2022 when, almost on a whim, I searched for his name online. And there he was, an old man with white hair, cutting a ribbon at a library opening in Vermont. The article mentioned that he was a retired professor of literature who had once been a Catholic priest. It gave no details of when or why he had left the priesthood, but there he was, alive and apparently well, living just a few hours' drive from Boston. I printed the article and kept it in my bedside table, looking at it every night before I went to sleep. For weeks, I did nothing else. Then one day, I found myself driving to the bank, asking to access my safety deposit box. The envelope was still there, yellowed with age but intact. Next to it was the scrap of paper with the Vermont address that Anthony had given me that night at Fenway Park, and the rosary with ME 1943 inscribed on it. I held the envelope for a long time, turning it over in my hands. It was addressed simply to ML. Not to me, not to Michael. Who was ML? Why had Anthony entrusted this to me, to give to our son when he turned 18? And why had I never had the courage to open it, even after Michael was well into adulthood? I put everything back in the box except the article about Anthony. I wasn't ready yet. I needed to think, to plan, to find my courage. A few days later, my granddaughter Elizabeth, Michael's oldest, named after his wife's grandmother, came to visit me. She was 22, a graduate student at BU, studying psychology. She had Michael's green eyes, the same eyes that had been passed down from Anthony. "Grandma," she said, as we sat in my kitchen drinking tea, "Dad mentioned something strange the other day. He said there's a family secret that you might be ready to talk about." I nearly dropped my teacup. What did he say exactly? Just that there was something about his birth that he's always wondered about. Something to do with his real father. She looked at me cautiously. He said he's never asked because he didn't want to upset you or Grandpa Robert. But now that Grandpa's been gone for a while, and with you turning 82 soon—" She trailed off, watching my face. I set my teacup down carefully. "Your father is very perceptive, always has been, even as a little boy." I took a deep breath. "Yes, there is a secret, a big one, and I think it's time to bring it out into the light." That night I called Michael and asked if he could come to Sunday dinner alone, without Jennifer and the kids. He agreed, though I could hear the concern in his voice. He probably thought I was going to tell him about some health issue, some diagnosis that I'd been keeping to myself. When he arrived that Sunday, I had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way his Grandma Callahan used to make it. We ate mostly in silence, making small talk about his work at the hospital, the kids' activities, the unusually warm fall we were having. When we finished, I cleared the plates and brought out apple pie and coffee. "Mom," Michael said finally, setting down his fork, "what's going on? You've barely touched your food, and you keep looking at me like—" He paused. "Like you're trying to memorize my face or something." I smiled, realizing he was right. I had been studying him, looking for traces of Anthony in his features, the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyebrows, those unmistakable green eyes. "I have something to tell you, Michael. Something I should have told you a long time ago." I got up and went to the sideboard, where I had placed the envelope from my safety deposit box, along with the newspaper article about Anthony and the small scrap of paper with the Vermont address. I set them on the table in front of him. "Your father," I said carefully, "your biological father, wasn't Robert Miller." Michael nodded slowly. "I've always known that, Mom. I mean, not known exactly, but suspected. The way he treated me differently from Jack and Tommy, the fact that I looked nothing like him or them, it wasn't hard to figure out." "Your real father was a Catholic priest," I said, the words coming out in a rush after being held back for so long. "Father Anthony Sullivan, from St. Augustine's Parish in South Boston. We fell in love the summer I was 19. When the church found out I was pregnant, they sent him to Alaska. I was forced to marry Robert, and you were raised as his son." Michael was silent for a long moment, looking at the items I had placed before him. Then he picked up the newspaper article, studying the photo of the elderly man cutting the ribbon. "This is him?" he asked quietly. "Yes. He lives in Vermont now. He left the priesthood at some point, became a literature professor." I pointed to the envelope. "He gave me this before he left. He said to give it to you when you turned 18, but I was afraid. I kept it all these years, never knowing what was inside." Michael turned the envelope over in his hands, much as I had done at the bank. "It's addressed to M.L., he said, looking up at me questioningly. "I don't know who that is," I admitted. "There are so many things I don't understand about this whole story. Anthony knew things about me, about my childhood, that he shouldn't have known. He had a photograph of a nun who looked just like me. He gave me a rosary with M.E. 1943 inscribed on it. I touched the beads, which I had brought out as well. He said I reminded him of someone he had lost, but he never fully explained." Michael was silent again, turning the envelope over and over in his hands. Then he looked up at me, those green eyes, Anthony's eyes, filled with a mixture of confusion and determination. "Mom, do you want to know what's in here, after all these years?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "And this man, Anthony Sullivan, he's still alive? Still in Vermont?" "According to that article, yes. It's from earlier this year." Michael took a deep breath. "I think we should go see him before we open this." He tapped the envelope. "I think there are questions that only he can answer." I felt a wave of fear and excitement wash over me. "You want to meet him? Your real father?" "I want answers," Michael said simply. "Don't you? After all these years?" I did. God help me, I did. I wanted to know why Anthony had come looking for me, why he said I reminded him of someone, who ML was, and what was in the envelope he had entrusted to me 60 years ago. "Yes," I said finally. "I want answers." "But Michael, are you sure? This could change everything we think we know about our family." "Mom, I'm 60 years old. I've had a good life, a blessed life. I have a career I love, a wife I adore, children I'm proud of. Nothing in this envelope or in Vermont can change that." He reached across the table and took my hand. "But don't you think it's time we knew the truth? All of it?" I looked at my son, my beautiful, kind, intelligent son who had never known his real father, and felt a surge of love and pride so strong it nearly took my breath away. "Yes," I said, squeezing his hand. "It's time." And so we made plans to go to Vermont the following weekend. Michael would tell Jennifer only that we were going to research some family history. I would bring the envelope, the rosary, and all the questions that had haunted me for 60 years. What we discovered when we got there would change everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, and about the Catholic Church's role in my life. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, we had to open the envelope. That Thanksgiving evening, after the turkey had been cleared away and the grandchildren sent to the living room to watch football, Michael and I sat alone at the dining room table, staring at the yellowed envelope addressed to ML. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe as my son carefully broke the seal that had remained intact for 6 decades. Inside was a small packet of papers and a photograph. Michael removed the photo first, an old black-and-white image of a building with a sign that read, "St. Mary's Orphanage, Providence, RI, 1942. Then he unfolded a document that appeared to be a birth certificate, aged and slightly damaged at the edges. This is your birth certificate," he said slowly, his green eyes, Anthony's eyes, scanning the page. "But it's not the one I've seen before." I leaned closer. "What does it say?" "Dorothy Elizabeth Collins," he read. "Born April 17, 1943, at St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers, Providence, Rhode Island." He looked up at me. "Mother's name, Sister Mary Elizabeth Sullivan. Father, unknown." My hands began to shake. "Sister Mary Elizabeth? A nun was my mother?" "There's more," Michael said, his voice catching as he pulled out a handwritten letter. The paper was thin, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Anthony's, the same elegant script I remembered from the parish bulletins he used to write. "My dearest Dorothy," Michael read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. "If you are reading this letter, our son is now 18 years old, and it is time for him to know the truth about his heritage. A truth that connects all 3 of us in ways you cannot imagine. I came to St. Augustine's Parish specifically to find you. For years, I searched through church records, orphanage files, and adoption papers to locate the daughter of my sister, Mary Elizabeth Sullivan. You, Dorothy. My sister was a novice nun at the Sisters of Mercy Convent in Providence. In 1942, while working at St. Mary's Orphanage, she fell in love with a young seminarian. When she became pregnant, the church separated them. He was sent to a seminary in the Midwest, and she was hidden away until she gave birth. Mary Elizabeth died shortly after childbirth from complications. Before she passed, she made me promise to someday find her child, you, and make sure you were safe and loved. I was only 15 when she died, but I kept that promise. I became a priest partly to gain access to church records that might help me find you. When I finally located you in South Boston and saw you singing in the choir that first Sunday, it was like seeing my sister's ghost. The resemblance was uncanny. I knew then that I had found Mary Elizabeth's daughter. What I never intended was to fall in love with you. When I realized my feelings, I was torn between my vow to my sister and my vow to God. I tried to fight it, but the connection between us was too strong to deny. There is more you need to know. While searching through the orphanage records, I discovered something shocking. Mary Elizabeth gave birth to twin girls. You, Dorothy, are one of those twins. Your sister, Elizabeth Dorothy, was taken away immediately by an older nun and given to another family. Despite my efforts, I was never able to locate your twin sister. Our son, Michael, is not just my son. He is also my nephew, carrying the blood of my beloved sister. I hope that one day the three of us can be reunited and perhaps even find your sister. The photograph enclosed is of St. Mary's Orphanage, where you and your twin were born. With all my love, Anthony Sullivan. Michael set down the letter, his face pale with shock. My God, he whispered. This is incredible. I couldn't speak. The room seemed to be spinning around me. All these years, I had thought I knew who I was, Dorothy Callahan from South Boston, daughter of Sebastian and Adelina, wife of Robert Miller, mother of Michael. But now I discovered that my entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. I wasn't born in South Boston, but in an orphanage in Providence. My parents weren't my biological parents. I had a twin sister somewhere in the world whom I had never met. And Anthony, the man I had loved, the father of my child, was actually my uncle. Mom? Michael's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you okay? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I don't know, I answered honestly. It's a lot to process. Michael was reading through the remaining papers. There's one more thing here, he said, pulling out a small note that had been tucked behind the letter. It's an address in Salem, Massachusetts, with a note. She's been watching you all these years. Salem, I repeated, the word sending a chill down my spine. Who's been watching me? It must be your twin, Michael said slowly. Elizabeth. We sat in silence for a long moment, the implications of this revelation sinking in. My twin sister, a woman with my face, my DNA, my blood, had been living just 20 miles away in Salem. Had she known about me all this time? Had she been watching me from a distance while I remained completely unaware of her existence? We need to go to Vermont first, to see Anthony, I said finally, and then to Salem. The door from the living room swung open, and Jennifer appeared, followed by the rest of the family. Is everything okay in here? She asked, her eyes moving from Michael's pale face to mine. We're fine, Michael said, quickly gathering the papers and tucking them back into the envelope. Mom's just been telling me some old family stories. Well, the kids want to know if we can have dessert now, Jennifer said, though her expression showed she knew something significant had happened. Of course, I said, forcing a smile. Apple pie and ice cream coming right up. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I went through the motions of serving dessert, making coffee, laughing at the right moments during family conversations. But my mind was elsewhere, grappling with the enormity of what I had just learned. The following weekend, Michael and I drove to Vermont. It was a beautiful fall day, the maple trees ablaze with red and gold leaves, the sky a clear, sharp blue. We followed the directions from the newspaper article to a small house on the outskirts of a town called Franklin. The man who answered the door was stooped with age, his hair white, his hands gnarled with arthritis. But his eyes, those green eyes that had once looked at me with such passion across a candle-lit table in the North End, were the same. Dorothy, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. After all these years. Hello, Anthony, I replied, my own voice barely audible. He looked at Michael, and for a moment I saw him sway slightly, as if the sight was almost too much to bear. You must be Michael, he said finally. You have my eyes. Yes, Michael said simply. I'm your son. Anthony invited us inside. His home was small but comfortable, lined with books, literature, philosophy, theology. On the mantelpiece was a photograph I recognized immediately, the young nun who looked so much like me, Sister Mary Elizabeth, my mother. We talked for hours. Anthony filled in the gaps in the story, explained how he had tracked me down through church records, how he had struggled with his feelings once he found me, how heartbroken he had been when we were discovered and separated. I left the priesthood 5 years after Alaska, he told us. I couldn't reconcile what had happened with my vows. I came back east, got a job teaching at a small college in Vermont, tried to build a life. But I never stopped thinking about you, about our son. Why didn't you try to contact us? I asked. I did once, he admitted, when Michael would have been about 10. I drove down to Brookline, sat across from your house for hours. I saw him playing in the yard with another boy, his brother, I assumed, and I saw your husband come home from work, saw how he greeted the boys, saw you come out onto the porch and call them in for dinner. You looked happy. I couldn't bring myself to disrupt that. I thought about those years, about the complicated, respectful relationship I had built with Robert, about the stable home we had provided for our sons. Anthony had been right. Breaking into that life would have caused pain and confusion. But still, the knowledge that he had been so close, had seen us and turned away, brought a fresh wave of grief for all we had lost. And Elizabeth? I asked. My twin sister? The note said she's been watching me. Anthony nodded slowly. That was the other reason I came that day. I had finally located her after years of searching. She was living in Salem by then. When I found her and told her about you, she asked me not to make contact yet. She wanted to observe you first, from a distance. She was afraid of disrupting your life, afraid you might reject her. So she's been watching me all these years, and I never knew? The thought was unsettling. Not in a creepy way, Anthony clarified quickly. She just kept tabs on you, drove by your house occasionally, attended a few school events for Michael from a distance. Once, she even stood behind you in line at Jordan Marsh during Christmas shopping, just to be near you. And she's still in Salem? As far as I know, I haven't been in regular contact with her, but the address I included in the envelope was current, as of a few years ago. As we prepared to leave, Anthony took Michael aside for a few minutes, the two of them talking quietly by the bookshelf. I stood by the door, looking at the photograph of Sister Mary Elizabeth, searching for myself in her features. I spent 82 years thinking I knew who I was, I said softly to Anthony as we said our goodbyes. A good Irish Catholic girl from Boston who made one mistake. But now I discover my whole life was only half the truth. And if there's another woman out there with my face, my DNA, living in Salem of all places, dear God, what else did the Catholic Church hide from us? And why Salem, the city of witches? Anthony took my hand, his touch bringing back a flood of memories from 60 years ago. The Church has kept many secrets over the centuries, Dorothy. Some to protect people, some to protect itself. But the truth has a way of coming out eventually. As Michael and I drove back to Boston that evening, we were mostly silent, each lost in our own thoughts. The revelations of the past few days had shaken the foundations of everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our family. What do you want to do about Salem? Michael asked finally, as we approached the city limits. About Elizabeth? I looked out at the Boston skyline, the city I had called home for most of my 82 years, the place where I had lived a life based on secrets and half-truths. I want to meet her, I said firmly. I want to meet my sister. And so, as our car merged onto the expressway toward home, I knew that our journey was far from over. The truth about my birth had been revealed, but there were still many questions to be answered. Why had the Church separated my twin and me at birth? Why had Elizabeth chosen to watch me from a distance rather than make contact? And what would happen when two women, identical in face but strangers in life, finally came face to face after 82 years? The answers would have to wait for another day. But for the first time in 6 decades, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. Hope that the missing pieces of my life might finally come together. Hope that the secrets of the past might lead to new beginnings in whatever time I had left. After all, at 82, it's never too late for the truth.